Have you ever found yourself caught in a situation where your words became your worst enemy? Where everything you said seemed to make things worse rather than better? I know I have. And after years of study, personal experience, and deep reflection, I've come to understand something profound about human interaction that has completely transformed my life, something I'm eager to share with you today. Silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's a powerful tool, perhaps the most underrated form of communication we possess. In certain situations, choosing silence can be the difference between success and failure, between building bridges and burning them, between inner peace and constant turmoil. Today, I want to take you on a journey through 6 critical situations where maintaining silence isn't just helpful, it's absolutely essential for your success, well-being, and personal growth. These aren't just abstract concepts. These are practical, applicable insights that you can implement in your life starting today. Before we dive in, I want you to know something important. This isn't about suppressing your voice or hiding your truth. This is about strategic communication, knowing when speaking serves you and when silence becomes your greatest ally. This is about empowerment through conscious choice rather than reactive speech. Let's begin with the first situation where silence becomes your greatest asset. Situation 1, when you're angry or emotionally charged. Think about the last time you spoke while you were truly angry. How did that work out for you? Did your words accurately reflect your true intentions? Did they solve the problem at hand? Or did they create new problems that weren't there before? When we're emotionally charged, especially with anger, our brain undergoes a fascinating transformation. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and decision-making, essentially goes offline. Meanwhile, our amygdala, the primitive, emotional center of our brain, takes over, triggering our fight or flight response. In this state, we're biologically programmed to protect ourselves, not to communicate effectively. Our words become weapons rather than tools for connection. We say things we don't mean, make promises we can't keep, and cause damage that sometimes can never be fully repaired. I learned this lesson the hard way in my early 20s. During a heated argument with someone close to me, I let my anger dictate my words. In less than 2 minutes, I said things that took over 2 years to heal. 2 years of rebuilding trust, of trying to explain that I didn't mean it, of wishing I could take back words that had already left their mark. That experience taught me something valuable. The temporary satisfaction of unleashing angry words pales in comparison to the lasting regret they leave behind. So what's the alternative? When you feel that familiar heat rising, when your heart starts racing and your thoughts become clouded with emotion, pause, breathe, choose silence, even if just temporarily. This doesn't mean you never address the issue. It means you address it from a place of clarity rather than chaos. It means you give yourself the gift of time to process, to cool down, to reconnect with your rational mind before engaging. I've developed a simple technique I call the October 10th 10 rule. When you're emotionally charged, ask yourself, will what I'm about to say matter in 10 minutes? Will it matter in 10 days? Will it matter in 10 years? If the answer to the last question is no, then perhaps those words don't need to be spoken at all, or at least not in the heat of the moment. Remember, in moments of anger, silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's not about letting others walk over you. It's about choosing your battles wisely and fighting them from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The next time anger tries to speak for you, let silence be your response. You'll be amazed at how many problems solve themselves when you don't add fuel to the fire with reactive words. Situation 2, when you don't have all the facts. We live in a world that rewards quick responses. Social media, instant messaging, and our fast-paced culture have conditioned us to believe that speed trumps accuracy. We feel pressured to have an immediate opinion on everything, to join every conversation, to weigh in on every issue. But this pressure often leads us to speak when we should listen, to conclude when we should question, to assert when we should explore. The reality is, speaking without complete information is like building a house on a foundation of sand. No matter how eloquent your words or how passionate your delivery, if they're not grounded in fact and understanding, they eventually collapse under scrutiny. I've witnessed countless professionals damage their credibility by speaking too soon. Executives making announcements before confirming details. Experts offering opinions on subjects they haven't thoroughly researched. Friends giving relationship advice without hearing both sides. In each case, what began as an attempt to appear knowledgeable ended in damaged trust. Several years ago, I was in a meeting where a major decision was being discussed. People around the table were offering their opinions, and I felt the pressure to contribute. Rather than admitting I didn't have enough information, I offered what seemed like a reasonable perspective based on the limited facts I had. Weeks later, when additional information came to light, it became clear that my recommendation would have led the team down a problematic path. I had spoken too soon, and it cost me some professional credibility. Since then, I've adopted a different approach. When I don't have all the facts, I embrace silence, not as a permanent state, but as a temporary position from which to gather information. I ask questions instead of making statements. I listen to understand rather than to respond. I give myself permission to say, I don't have enough information to form a solid opinion on that yet. This approach has not only saved me from countless potential mistakes, but has also, somewhat paradoxically, enhanced my reputation as someone whose words carry weight, precisely because they aren't offered carelessly. In our information-rich yet wisdom-poor world, there's something refreshingly trustworthy about someone who doesn't feel compelled to have an instant opinion on everything. There's authority in the voice that speaks only when it has something valuable to contribute. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where you don't have all the facts, choose silence. Use that silence to listen, to learn, to gather the information you need to speak with genuine authority when the time is right. Your reputation will thank you. Situation 3, when your words can't improve the silence. There's a beautiful Swedish proverb that says, fear less, hope more, eat less, chew more, whine less, breathe more, talk less, say more. These words contain a profound truth about communication. Quantity rarely. We've all been in situations where someone was speaking simply to fill the air, rambling without purpose, adding words without adding value. Perhaps we've even been that person ourselves. It's a common impulse, driven by our discomfort with silence and our desire to be seen and heard. But effective communication isn't about filling space. It's about creating value. It's not about how much you say, but about how much meaning your words carry. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can contribute to a conversation is nothing at all. I remember attending a conference where one of the panelists barely spoke, while others jumped to answer every question, offering lengthy responses to showcase their expertise. This individual remained silent unless she had something truly insightful to contribute. When she did speak, the entire room leaned in. Her words carried weight precisely because they weren't diluted by unnecessary chatter. After the panel, everyone was talking about her contributions. Even though quantitatively she had spoken the least, she understood something fundamental. Impact comes from value, not volume. This principle applies beyond professional settings, in personal relationships, in community discussions. In any context where communication occurs, we face a choice to speak and potentially add noise, or to remain silent until we can genuinely add value. I've adopted a simple mental filter for my own communication. Does what I'm about to say improve upon the silence? If the answer is no, I keep quiet. This doesn't mean I only speak when I have something profound to offer. Sometimes a kind word, a clarifying question, or even appropriate humor improves upon silence. But it does mean I try to ensure my words serve a purpose beyond filling space or centering attention on myself. This practice has radically changed the quality of my relationships and interactions. I find that people listen more when I speak less. My words carry greater impact. Conversations become more meaningful and less exhausting. And perhaps most importantly, I create space for others to share their wisdom rather than always inserting my own. In a world where everyone is talking, silence becomes a superpower. Not the awkward silence of someone who has nothing to contribute, but the thoughtful silence of someone who values quality over quantity, meaning over noise. So before you speak, ask yourself, does what I'm about to say improve upon the silence? If not, perhaps the greatest contribution you can make to that moment is to remain quiet and create space for something more valuable to emerge. Situation 4, when you're still processing information. In our rapidly moving world, we've normalized instant responses to complex situations. Someone shares a problem and we immediately offer solutions. A challenging situation arises and we're expected to have an immediate plan. A question is posed and we feel compelled to answer on the spot. But meaningful processing, the kind that leads to genuine insight and effective action, rarely happens instantaneously. It requires time, reflection, and often silence. Our brains need space to connect dots, to integrate new information with existing knowledge, to move beyond surface-level reactions to deeper understanding. When we rush to respond before this processing has occurred, we shortchange ourselves and others of our best thinking. I've learned this lesson repeatedly throughout my career. Early on, I prided myself on quick responses. I thought my ability to immediately address any question or challenge was a strength. What I didn't realize was that while my responses were quick, they were rarely my best work. During one particularly important strategic planning session, a colleague raised a complex challenge our organization was facing. True to form, I immediately jumped in with what I thought was a brilliant solution. The room nodded along, and I felt that familiar satisfaction of having solved the problem. A week later, after more reflection, I realized my solution had addressed only the symptoms, not the underlying cause. Had I given myself time to process, even just 24 hours, I would have seen the deeper patterns at play and offered something far more valuable. Instead, my quick response had actually taken the team down a less effective path. Since then, I've given myself permission to process. When faced with complex information or challenging questions, I now often say, I'd like to think about that and circle back. Or, that's an important question that deserves careful consideration. Can I reflect on it and share my thoughts tomorrow? This approach has transformed the quality of my contributions. My responses may come a bit later, but they're infinitely more valuable because they emerge from genuine processing rather than reactive thinking. This doesn't mean we should never respond in the moment. Some situations do require immediate action or feedback. But we can develop the discernment to know when immediate response serves us and when taking time to process would yield better results. In your own life, I encourage you to recognize the value of processing time. When you feel that internal pressure to respond immediately to something complex, pause, take a breath, give yourself permission to say, I need some time to think about this. Choose the silence of thoughtful processing over the noise of reactive response. Your colleagues, friends, family members, and most importantly, your own best thinking will thank you for it. Situation 5, when others need to be heard. Have you ever been in a conversation where you were barely listening to the other person because you were too busy formulating what you were going to say next? Or perhaps you've experienced the frustration of trying to express something important only to have the other person jump in with their own stories. solutions or perspectives before you've fully articulated yours. One of the greatest gifts we can offer another human being is the gift of being truly heard. Not partially heard while we mentally prepare our response, not temporarily heard until we can find an opening to share our own perspective, but fully, completely heard without interruption, without judgment, without the distraction of our own internal dialogue. This kind of listening requires silence, not just external silence where we refrain from speaking, but internal silence where we quiet our own thoughts to create space for someone else's. I learned the transformative power of this kind of silence through my relationship with a mentor who had mastered the art of deep listening. During our conversations, I had his complete attention. He wasn't checking his phone, formulating his response, or waiting for his turn to speak. He was fully present, absorbing not just my words, but the meaning and emotion behind them. After one particularly challenging period in my life, I scheduled time with him, desperate for his advice. I arrived with a long list of questions and problems I wanted him to solve. For nearly an hour, he did nothing but listen, occasionally asking a clarifying question, but never inserting his own opinions or experiences. At the end of that hour, something remarkable had happened. In the space of his silence, I had discovered my own answers by simply creating room for my thoughts to unfold fully. He had facilitated a kind of self-discovery that no amount of advice could have accomplished. This experience fundamentally changed how I approach conversations, especially when someone needs support. I've learned that often the most helpful thing I can do is not to speak at all, but to create a container of attentive silence where others can explore their own thoughts and feelings without interruption. This doesn't mean I never offer input or share my own experiences, but it does mean I've learned to discern when someone needs my voice and when they simply need my attention. I've learned that silence isn't passive, it's an active choice to create space for someone else's voice rather than filling the air with my own. In your own relationships, I invite you to experiment with this kind of generative silence. The next time someone comes to you with a problem or concern, resist the urge to immediately offer solutions. Relate it back to your own experience or fill conversational gaps. Instead, give them the rare gift of your complete attention. Ask thoughtful questions that create space for deeper exploration rather than redirecting the conversation to your perspective. You might be surprised at how powerful your silence can be in helping others discover their own wisdom and feel truly seen and valued in the process. Situation 6, when you're at your learning edge. Growth happens at the edge of our comfort zone, in that space where we're stretching beyond what we already know but haven't yet mastered new territory. This space of learning and development is sacred, and often it requires silence. When we're learning something new, whether it's a professional skill, a personal insight, or a different way of relating to others, we're vulnerable, we're incomplete, we're in process. In these moments, premature expression can actually hinder our growth rather than support it. I experienced this firsthand when I began studying a completely new field midway through my career. Excited about my new knowledge, I was eager to share what I was learning, to demonstrate my growing expertise. I would regularly weave my new concepts into conversations, presentations, and writings. What I didn't recognize at the time was that these premature expressions were actually solidifying half-formed ideas. By speaking about concepts I was still in the process of understanding, I was crystallizing my learning at an incomplete stage rather than allowing it the silence it needed to fully develop. A wise colleague pulled me aside after one particularly enthusiastic but somewhat confused presentation. "You have something valuable brewing," he said, "but it needs more time in silence before it's ready to be served." His words stung initially, but they contained a truth I needed to hear. I began to approach my learning differently, Rather than immediately expressing each new concept or insight, I gave myself permission to hold ideas in a space of private reflection. I journaled instead of posted on social media. I engaged in one-on-one discussions with trusted mentors rather than presenting to large groups. I allowed my understanding to develop in the nurturing container of relative silence before exposing it to the world. The result was transformative. When I did eventually begin sharing my new expertise more widely, it had a depth, nuance, and integration that my earlier expressions had lacked. The silence had served as a developmental space where incomplete ideas could grow into genuine wisdom. This principle applies to all forms of learning and growth. New leadership approaches need time to integrate before being widely implemented. Personal insights need space to deepen before being shared. Relationship patterns need private reflection before public discussion. If you find yourself at a learning edge in any area of your life, consider giving yourself the gift of developmental silence. This doesn't mean you never discuss what you're learning. Selective sharing with trusted others can be invaluable for growth. But it does mean recognizing that not every insight needs immediate expression, and that some of your most important growth will happen in the quiet spaces between your words. The courage to be silent. As we've explored these 6 situations where silence serves us, you might have noticed something important. Choosing silence often requires significant courage. In a world that equates silence with weakness, that rewards the loudest voices rather than the wisest ones, that constantly pushes us to express, share, and broadcast, choosing thoughtful silence can feel countercultural and even scary. It takes courage to remain silent when you're angry, to resist the temporary satisfaction of unleashing heated words. It takes courage to admit you don't have all the facts rather than offering a hasty opinion. It takes courage to refrain from filling empty space with your voice when your words don't add value. It takes courage to give yourself processing time rather than responding immediately. It takes courage to create space for others to be heard rather than centering conversations on your own experiences. And it takes courage to keep your learning private until it's fully developed rather than seeking validation for half-formed ideas. This courage, the courage to be silent, is perhaps one of the most underrated forms of bravery in our modern world. It's a quiet strength that doesn't call attention to itself, but profoundly shapes the quality of our lives and relationships. I've come to believe that this form of courage is something we can develop, like a muscle that grows stronger with use. Each time we choose strategic silence over reactive speech, we build our capacity for this kind of bravery. Each time we resist the social pressure to fill space with noise. As you move forward from this conversation, I invite you to notice opportunities to practice the courage of silence in your own life. When anger rises, can you pause before speaking? When you lack complete information, can you resist the urge to offer a premature opinion? When the situation calls for listening rather than speaking, can you create that space for others? These small moments of chosen silence might seem insignificant in isolation, but collectively, they have the power to transform your communication, your relationships, and ultimately, your life. The balance of voice and silence. As we near the end of our time together, I want to address an important question that might be arising in your mind. Does this mean I should always be silent? Am I suggesting that you suppress your voice, hide your truth, or remain passive in the face of injustice or mistreatment? Absolutely not. The wisdom I'm sharing today isn't about silencing yourself. It's about using silence strategically as part of a balanced approach to communication. It's about recognizing that effective self-expression includes knowing both when to speak and when to remain quiet. Your voice matters. Your perspectives, experiences, and wisdom are valuable and deserving of expression. There are absolutely times when speaking up is not just appropriate, but essential. When addressing injustice, when setting healthy boundaries, when sharing your authentic truth, when offering your unique gifts to the world. The key is discernment, developing the wisdom to know when speaking serves your highest good and the good of others, and when silence would be more beneficial. This discernment doesn't develop overnight. It's cultivated through practice, reflection, and yes, sometimes through making mistakes and learning from them. I believe we each have a responsibility to find our authentic voice and use it in service of our values and vision. But I also believe that voice becomes more powerful, more impactful, and more authentic when it emerges from a foundation of thoughtful silence rather than reactive noise. Think of it this way: silence isn't the opposite of voice. It's the foundation from which our truest voice emerges. Just as the most powerful music contains both notes and rests, the most effective communication includes both speech and silence, each enhancing the other through conscious choice rather than habitual reaction. As you move forward from our conversation today, I invite you to explore your own relationship with silence. Notice the situations where strategic silence might serve you better than immediate speech. Experiment with creating more space between your thoughts and your words. Discover the power that emerges when you choose your moments of expression with greater intention. And remember that this journey toward balanced communication isn't about perfection. It's about practice. There will be times when you speak when silence would have served better, and times when you remain silent when speaking up would have been appropriate. Each of these moments offers valuable information for refining your discernment moving forward. The inner dimension of silence. Before we conclude, I want to touch on one final aspect of silence that we haven't yet explored: its inner dimension. So far, we've primarily discussed external silence, the choice to refrain from speaking in certain situations. But there's another form of silence that's equally powerful: inner silence, the quieting of our mental chatter to create space for deeper wisdom to emerge. Most of us live with a constant stream of internal dialogue, judgments, commentaries, rehearsals, replays, worries, and plans flowing through our minds in an endless loop. This internal noise often drowns out our deeper knowing, our intuition, our connection to what some might call our higher wisdom. The 6 situations we've discussed today invite not just external silence, but internal silence as well. When we're angry, the challenge isn't just to refrain from speaking, but to quiet our internal story about how we've been wronged. When we don't have all the facts, we're invited to silence our assumptions and prejudgments. Along with our premature conclusions, when we're choosing whether our words improve upon the silence, we're asked to quiet our ego's need for attention or validation. When we're processing new information, we benefit from silencing our habitual thinking patterns to allow fresh insights to emerge. When creating space for others to be heard, we need to silence our internal planning for what we'll say next. And when we're at our learning edge, we're invited to quiet the voice of our inner critic that demands perfection rather than growth. Cultivating this inner silence is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the practice we're discussing today. While external silence might require courage, inner silence requires something even more fundamental: awareness. We need to become aware of our mental patterns, our habitual internal dialogues, and the ways they shape our experience and expression. Various contemplative traditions have developed practices specifically designed to cultivate this inner silence: meditation, mindfulness, centering prayer, and many others. While these practices take different forms, they share a common intention: to create space between our awareness and our thoughts, allowing us to observe our mental patterns rather than being completely identified with them. Even a few minutes of intentional inner silence each day can begin to transform your relationship with external silence. As you become more familiar with the quiet space beneath your thoughts, you'll find it easier to access that space in the midst of challenging situations, giving you greater choice about when and how to express yourself. This inner dimension of silence isn't separate from the practical situations we've explored today. It's the foundation that makes those choices possible. Without some degree of inner silence, the strategic external silence we're discussing remains theoretical rather than lived experience. The path forward. As we come to the close of our exploration today, I want to acknowledge that cultivating strategic silence, both external and internal, is a lifelong journey rather than a destination. None of us will perfect this practice overnight, and all of us will face situations that challenge our commitment to thoughtful communication. The good news is that each day offers multiple opportunities to practice. Each conversation, each challenging emotion, each new learning, each interaction with others presents a choice. Reactive speech or thoughtful silence. Habitual response or conscious communication. I encourage you to approach this practice with self-compassion rather than perfectionism. Notice when you slip into old patterns of reactive speech. Learn from those moments and gently recommit to your intention of more balanced communication. Celebrate the times when you successfully choose strategic silence, not from a place of suppression, but from a place of wisdom and discernment. Over time, you'll likely notice subtle but significant shifts in your relationships, your effectiveness, and your sense of inner peace. Conversations become more meaningful, conflicts become less volatile, learning becomes deeper, and your words, when you do choose to speak, carry greater impact because they emerge from a foundation of thoughtful silence rather than reactive noise. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate your voice, but to ensure that when you speak, you're truly saying something worth hearing. The goal isn't permanent silence, but strategic silence. Knowing when to speak and when to refrain based on what truly serves your highest good and the good of those around you. In a world filled with constant noise, the ability to access and offer silence is a rare and precious gift. A gift to yourself in the form of greater clarity and peace, and a gift to others in the form of more meaningful connection and communication. I invite you to begin or deepen this practice today. Notice the next opportunity for strategic silence that arises in your life. Perhaps it will be during a moment of frustration or anger. Perhaps it will be when you're tempted to offer an opinion without complete information. Perhaps it will be when someone else needs to be heard without interruption. Whatever form it takes, experiment with choosing silence in that moment, not as a passive response, but as an active choice rooted in wisdom and discernment. Notice what happens both within yourself and in the interaction. What becomes possible in that space of silence that might not have emerged otherwise. This simple practice, repeated over time, has the power to transform not just your communication, but your entire experience of life and relationships. It's a practice that has profoundly changed my own journey, and one that I believe has similar potential for anyone willing to explore it with intention and openness. The ripple effect. As we've explored the power of strategic silence in various situations, we've primarily focused on its direct benefits to you, how it can enhance your effectiveness, deepen your relationships, and support your personal growth. But there's another dimension of this practice that extends far beyond your individual experience. The ripple effect your conscious communication creates in the world around you. Each time you choose thoughtful silence over reactive speech, you're not just making a personal choice. You're influencing the communication ecosystem of which you're a part. Your choice creates space for others to reflect rather than react. It models a different way of engaging that others may begin to emulate. It shifts the dynamics of conversations from competitive talking to collaborative understanding. In a world where reactive communication drives polarization, conflict, and misunderstanding, your practice of strategic silence becomes a small but significant act of cultural transformation. It's a quiet revolution against the noise that drowns out wisdom, connection, and truth in our collective discourse. I've witnessed this ripple effect in my own life and work. In team environments where I've practiced and eventually taught the principles we've discussed today, communication patterns gradually shift. People interrupt less and listen more. Reactive responses decrease while thoughtful contributions increase. The collective intelligence of the group emerges more fully because it's no longer drowned out by habitual noise. In personal relationships, this practice creates similar transformations. As one person begins to choose strategic silence over reactive speech, the other person often unconsciously follows suit. Conversations become more spacious, with room for thoughts to complete themselves rather than colliding in midair. Conflicts become less frequent and resolve more easily because they're no longer fueled by hasty words spoken in the heat of emotion. This ripple effect extends to digital communication as well. In a social media landscape characterized by immediate reactions, hot takes, and performative outrage, your choice to pause before posting, to reflect before responding, to occasionally remain silent rather than adding to the noise, creates a different kind of presence, one that stands out precisely because of its thoughtfulness and restraint. None of this means you should never engage in digital discourse or express strong opinions. Rather, it suggests that when you do engage, your contributions can emerge from reflection rather than reaction, adding genuine value rather than simply increasing volume. The cumulative impact of these individual choices is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Like a stone dropped in still water, each instance of chosen silence creates ripples that extend far beyond the initial point of impact, influencing patterns of communication in ways we might never fully recognize. As you continue this practice in your own life, I invite you to notice not just how it affects your personal experience, but how it influences the communication dynamics around you. Notice how your thoughtful silence might create space for others to discover their own wisdom. Notice how your restraint in heated moments might de-escalate potential conflicts before they begin. Notice how your careful listening might inspire others to listen more attentively as well. In noticing these ripple effects, you may discover that your practice of strategic silence isn't just a personal development tool. It's a meaningful contribution to a world desperately in need of more thoughtful communication. Silence as presence. As we continue our exploration, I want to introduce a subtle but important distinction, the difference between silence as absence and silence as presence. When most people think of silence, they imagine it as an emptiness, a void, a lack of something. But the kind of silence we're discussing today is quite the opposite. It's a fullness, a richness, a quality of presence that's anything but empty. Think of the difference between the awkward silence that falls when someone doesn't know what to say and the comfortable silence shared between two people who are deeply connected. The first feels like an absence, a gap to be filled. The second feels like a presence, a space of connection that needs no words. The strategic silence we've been exploring throughout our conversation is much more like the second example. It's not about withdrawing or disengaging, but about being fully present without the need to fill space with words. It's about bringing your complete attention to the moment rather than diluting it with unnecessary speech. This quality of present silence transforms how others experience your listening. When you're silent but distracted, physically quiet but mentally elsewhere, people sense your absence even if they can't name it. But when you're silent and fully present, physically quiet and valued by your attention, I experienced this distinction powerfully during a period of personal challenge when I sought support from two different friends. The first listened to my struggles while occasionally checking their phone, frequently interjecting with their own stories and quickly offering solutions before I had fully expressed my situation. Though they spoke a lot and offered many words of encouragement, I left, feeling somewhat unheard and alone. The second friend barely spoke at all, but their silence was filled with presence. They maintained eye contact, nodded to show understanding, and asked occasional questions that helped me explore my own thoughts more deeply. Though they offered far fewer words, I left that conversation feeling profoundly supported and understood. The difference wasn't in how much they spoke, but in the quality of presence they brought to their silence. The first friend's verbose response felt like an absence despite all the words. The second friend's quiet presence felt like a gift, precisely because of its fullness. As you practice strategic silence in your own life, I encourage you to focus not just on refraining from speech, but on cultivating this quality of present silence. When you choose not to speak in order to listen to someone else, bring your full attention to their words, their emotions, their unspoken communications. When you pause before responding to process information, stay engaged with the conversation rather than mentally checking out. This distinction between absent silence and present silence might seem subtle, but its impact on your relationships and effectiveness is profound. People don't simply need you to stop talking. They need you to be fully there in your silence, bringing your complete attention and authentic presence to the space between words. The freedom of chosen silence. As we near the conclusion of our time together, I want to address one final aspect of strategic silence that often goes unrecognized: the profound freedom it offers. In a culture that equates self-expression with freedom, suggesting limitations on when and how we speak might initially seem constraining rather than liberating, but paradoxically, the practice we've been exploring today actually expands our freedom rather than restricting it. When we react habitually to situations, speaking immediately when angry, offering opinions without complete information, filling every silence with our voice, we're not exercising freedom. We're operating on autopilot, driven by conditioning, social pressure, and unconscious patterns rather than conscious choice. True freedom doesn't come from indulging every impulse to speak. It comes from creating space between stimulus and response. Space in which we can choose our words or our silence based on our deepest values and intentions rather than our most reactive impulses. The practices we've explored today, pausing when angry, giving ourselves time to process information, choosing silence when our words don't add value, create exactly this kind of space. They insert a moment of awareness and choice between the trigger and our response, freeing us from the tyranny of automatic reaction. I experienced this freedom most powerfully during a high-stakes negotiation where the other party used aggressive tactics and provocative language, clearly attempting to trigger an emotional response. In my earlier years, I would have taken the bait, responding with matching intensity and likely derailing the entire process. But through years of practicing strategic silence, I had developed the capacity to notice my triggered response without immediately acting on it. I felt the familiar heat of defensiveness rising, but was able to create space between that feeling and my next move. In that space, I chose silence, not as a passive surrender, but as an active strategy that prevented the conversation from descending into unproductive. That chosen silence completely changed the dynamic of the negotiation. Without the fuel of my reactive response, the other party's aggressive approach quickly lost momentum. The conversation reset itself, eventually leading to a productive outcome that served everyone's interests. In that moment, I experienced the freedom that comes from choosing our response rather than being driven by reaction. The freedom to align our communication with our highest intentions rather than our most impulsive emotions. This freedom extends beyond professional settings into every aspect of our lives. In family dynamics, it's the freedom to break generational patterns of reactive communication rather than perpetuating them. In friendships, it's the freedom to listen generously rather than centering every conversation on our own experience. In our inner life, it's the freedom to witness our thoughts rather than being completely identified with them. As you continue to explore strategic silence in your own life, I invite you to notice the expanded sense of freedom it creates. Not freedom from all constraints, but freedom to choose your response based on your deepest values rather than your most habitual reactions. Notice how this freedom allows you to show up more authentically in your relationships, your work, and your inner experience. This freedom, the freedom of chosen response rather than automatic reaction, is perhaps the greatest gift that the practice of strategic silence offers us. It's a freedom that paradoxically comes not from expressing everything we think and feel in the moment, but from creating space to discern what truly deserves expression.